Good morning, my YouTube viewers. In this video, what we're going to be talking about is hypothesis test, because the nature of this course is on hypothesis test. And we finally got to the actual chapter in the course that deals with hypothesis test. So hypothesis testing is a fundamental statistical tool that allows researchers to make inferences about population parameters based on sample data. It provides structured methodology for determining whether there is enough evidence to support a specific hypothesis. At its core, hypothesis testing is a method used to assess the validity of a claim or hypothesis about a population parameter. The primary objective is to determine whether the observed data provides sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis, HO, in favor of an alternative hypothesis, H1 or HA. The null hypothesis, HO, represents the default or status quo, while the alternative hypothesis, H1 or HA, signifies the presence of an effect or difference. So we've got some key components of hypothesis testing. You've got the null and alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis, HO, is a statement asserting that there is no effect, difference, or relationship between variables. It serves as the benchmark of testing. And then you have the alternative hypothesis, and that's H1 or HA, represents the claim that there is an effect, difference, or relationship. It challenges the null hypothesis. Then you have the test statistic, and we've used the test statistic in previous videos. The test statistic is a standardized value computed from a sample during a hypothesis test. It measures the degree of agreement between the sample data and the null hypothesis. Common test statistics include z-scores, t-scores, chi-square values, and f-values. So basically, if you have a t distribution, you're going to have a t-score. If you have a z distribution or a normal distribution, you're going to have a z-score. If you have a chi-square distribution, you're going to have a chi-square value. And if you have an f distribution, you're going to have an f value. So we've got the significance level. The significance level denoted by as an A for alpha. And sometimes it'll be called alpha. Is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is actually true. It represents the threshold for determining statistical significance. Common significant levels are 0.05, 0.01, and 0.1. And I mentioned that before in previous videos. You have the p-value. The p-value is a percentage. It's from 0 and 1. So the p-value is the probability of obtaining a test statistic as extreme as or more extreme than the observed value, assuming that the null hypothesis is true. A small p-value, typically less than A or alpha, indicates a strong evidence against the null hypothesis. Then you have the decision rule. The decision rule involves comparing the p-value to the significance level alpha. If the p-value is less than alpha, the null hypothesis is rejected in favor of the alternative hypothesis. Otherwise, the null hypothesis is not rejected. And now we have types of hypothesis tests. So you have the one-sample test. The one-sample test involves comparing a sample statistic, e.g. a mean or proportion, to a known population parameter. These examples include the one-sample t-test and the one-sample z-test. You have two sample tests. These tests compare the sample statistics of two independent groups to determine if there is a significance between them. Examples include the independent two-sample t-test and the two-sample z-test. And then you have paired sample test. Paired sample tests or dependent sample tests compare the means of two related groups. They are often used in before and after studies. An example is the paired t-test. So in previous videos, we did two-sample independence tests, and we also did two-sample paired tests. And the thing is that you need to keep in mind is you need to make sure that you perform the right test for the data that you are sampling, because if the data is related and you use an independent test, then it's not going to give an accurate reading. And then if the data is not related and you use a paired test, then that too is not going to give an accurate reading. So that's why you need to make sure that if the data is not related, you use an independent two-sample test. And then if the data is related, you use a paired sample test. And I'm going to say here. Okay, then you have your chi-square test. Chi-square tests are used to examine the association between categorical values. Examples include the chi-square test for independence and the chi-square goodness of fit test. And then you have the ANOVA, the analysis of variance. The ANOVA test compares the means of 3 or more groups to determine if at least one group mean is significantly different from the others. Variants of ANOVA include one-way ANOVA and two-way ANOVA. So we have some practical considerations. Hypothesis testing finds applications across various fields, including healthcare, economics, psychology, and engineering. And then so some examples are healthcare. Hypothesis testing can be used to evaluate the effectiveness of new treatments or medications. For example, a clinical trial may compare the recovery rates of patients receiving a new drug versus a placebo. You have economics. In economics, hypothesis tests assess the impact of policy changes on economic indicators. For example, a study might examine whether a tax reform leads to a significant increase in employment rates. You have psychology. In psychology, researchers use hypothesis tests to investigate the effects of interventions on behavioral outcomes. An experiment might test whether a new teaching method improves students' test scores. And then you have engineering. Engineers use hypothesis tests to ensure the quality and reliability of manufacturing processes. For instance, a quality control test might determine if the defect rate in a production line exceeds a specified threshold. So that's it for the hypothesis test. And the next videos, we're going to be doing some practice questions. So I hope that you decide to watch the next videos where we cover practice questions with hypothesis test.